The wooden box sat on Steve Harvey's podium like it contained the secrets of the universe, hand-carved, weathered by decades of loving touch. It was the kind of object that carries stories in its very grain. But what was inside that simple box would stop Family Feud mid-show and remind everyone watching what true wealth really means. Steve stared at the gift that 65-year-old Walter Thompson had just placed in front of him, his usual quick wit completely absent. The studio had fallen into that particular kind of silence that happens when something sacred interrupts something ordinary. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. "Mr. Harvey," Walter had said moments before, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he offered the box. "This here's the only valuable thing I got left in this world, and I want you to have it." Those words hung in the air like a prayer, because everyone in that studio understood they were witnessing something far more important than entertainment. This was about dignity, about legacy, about what happens when a man who has lost everything still finds a way to give. Let me take you back to how we arrived at this moment. How a routine, Family Feud taping became a masterclass in grace under pressure. It was a crisp October morning at the Steve Harvey Studios in Atlanta. The autumn light streamed through the high windows, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. The energy was typical for a Tuesday taping. Competitive families, enthusiastic audience, and Steve Harvey ready to work his magic, with that perfect blend of humor and heart that had made him America's favorite game show host. The Thompson family from Oakley, Kansas, had driven 18 hours straight to be there. You could see the journey in their clothes, slightly wrinkled, despite their best efforts, in their wide eyes as they took in the studio lights, in the way they clustered together like they were still amazed they'd made it this far. Walter Thompson stood at the center of his family, like the trunk of an old oak tree. At 65, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had worked the land for 40 years. His hands, large and calloused, told stories of sunrise mornings and sunset evenings, spent coaxing life from the soil. His face, deeply lined by decades of Kansas sun and wind, held the kind of wisdom that only comes from understanding the cycles of planting and harvest, growth and loss. Beside him stood his daughter Sarah, 35, a teacher from Topeka who had driven home every weekend for the past year to help her father sort through the aftermath of losing the family farm. His son Michael, 32, had taken time off from his job at the grain elevator to be here, and scattered around them were grandchildren, ranging in age from 8 to 16, all wearing their best clothes and barely contained excitement. But there was something different about Walter. While his family buzzed with the energy of being on television, Walter seemed to carry a weight that had nothing to do with stage lights or cameras. During the pre-show meet and greet, when other contestants chatted excitedly about their chances of winning, Walter had been quiet, polite, but distant. Steve had noticed it immediately. After 30 years in entertainment, he'd developed an instinct for reading people, for sensing when someone was carrying more than they were letting on. When he'd approached the Thompson family during introductions, Walter had shaken his hand with a grip that spoke of decades of hard work, but his eyes held something that made Steve pause. "Mr. Thompson," Steve had said, "where you folks from?" "Oakley, Kansas," Walter had replied, his voice carrying the flat vowels of the Great Plains. "Been farming there my whole life." "Well, was farming there?" Something in that past tense had caught Steve's attention, but before he could ask more, it was time for the show to begin. The Thompson family had been selected to compete against the Rodriguez family from Phoenix, and the game started with typical Family Feud energy. Steve cracked jokes, the families gave enthusiastic answers, and the scoreboard lit up with each successful guess. But as the game progressed, Steve found himself drawn repeatedly to Walter. While his family celebrated good answers and groaned at missed opportunities, Walter stood at his position with a stillness that seemed almost meditative. He participated when it was his turn, gave solid answers that earned points, but there was something in his demeanor that suggested his mind was somewhere else entirely. It was during the fourth round that Walter's difference became impossible to ignore. The survey question was, name something people work their whole lives to build. Sarah had given the number one answer, a family. The Thompson clan erupted in celebration, high-fiving and hugging as they realized they were within striking distance of winning the game. But Walter didn't celebrate. Instead, he closed his eyes for just a moment, and Steve saw something pass across his face like a cloud shadow moving across a field. Pain, maybe, or loss, or something deeper than either. Steve's comedian instincts told him to keep the energy high, to ride the wave of excitement the family was feeling. But something else, some deeper instinct, made him set down his cards and walk over to Walter. "Mr. Thompson," Steve said, his voice lower now, more personal. "You okay, sir?" Walter opened his eyes and looked at Steve with an expression that seemed to carry decades of stories. "I'm fine, Mr. Harvey, just thinking about things people build their whole lives, and what happens when those things get taken away." The studio didn't go quiet immediately. The Rodriguez family was still strategizing, the audience was still buzzing, and the production team was preparing for the next segment. But something in Walter's tone made Steve forget about everything else. "What kind of things you thinking about?" Steve asked, and everyone watching could hear that this wasn't game show banter anymore. This was one human being genuinely asking another about their pain. Walter was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands gripping the podium. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but it carried the weight of someone who had been holding something heavy for a very long time. "Lost my farm 6 months ago, Mr. Harvey. Bank took it after the drought killed 3 straight years of crops. 120 acres. My grandfather bought, in 1923, house where I raised my children. Where my wife..." He paused, his voice catching slightly. "Where my wife spent her last days before the cancer took her 2 years ago." The studio began to quiet around them as people sensed that something profound was happening. The Rodriguez family stopped their strategizing. Audience members leaned forward. Even the camera operators seemed to focus more intently. "Lost everything except what's in that old truck outside," Walter continued. "Drove here on our last $100 because Sarah here thought maybe, just maybe, we could win enough to start over somewhere. But sitting here, listening to that question about what people build their whole lives, I realized something." Steve waited, giving Walter the space to say what he needed to say. "I realized that the most valuable thing I built wasn't the farm or the house or any of that. It was this family standing beside me. And that's something no bank can take away, no drought can kill, no amount of bad luck can touch." Behind him, his family had gone quiet too, not with embarrassment, but with pride. They were seeing their patriarch, the man who had carried them through every crisis, finally allowing himself to acknowledge the depth of his loss while simultaneously recognizing what remained unbroken. Steve Harvey, who had hosted thousands of episodes and heard every kind of story imaginable, found himself facing something he'd never encountered before. Not just hardship, not just loss, but grace in the face of devastation, dignity that couldn't be foreclosed on, wisdom that came from understanding what actually matters when everything else is stripped away. "Mr. Thompson," Steve said, his voice thick with emotion, "I think you might be the richest man who's ever stood on this stage." Walter smiled, then, the first genuine smile Steve had seen from him all day. "That's kind of you say, Mr. Harvey, but I got something else I want to tell you." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small wooden box, hand-carved with intricate patterns that spoke of hours of careful work. The wood was dark, with age and handling, polished smooth by decades of touch. "My wife Martha made this for me on our first wedding anniversary," Walter said, holding the box carefully in both hands. 42 years ago, been carrying it in my pocket every day since she passed, keeping it close to my heart." He held the box out towards Steve. "I want you to have it." Steve's mouth fell open slightly. "Mr. Thompson, I can't take something that precious to you." But Walter was already walking around the podium, approaching Steve with the kind of determination that comes from a decision made long before the moment arrives. "Mr. Harvey," Walter said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke, "I've been watching you for years. Every day at lunch break, when the other farmers would watch sports, I'd tune into Family Feud, watched how you treat people, how you listen to their stories, how you make every single person who walks onto this stage feel like they matter." He reached Steve and held out the box. "When Martha was dying, She spent her last good days watching your show with me. Said you reminded her of her father, how he could make anyone feel welcome at his table. She said people like you are rare, and when you find them, you hold on to them. Steve stared at the offered gift, his usual quick response completely absent. Sir, I can't accept something that personal. Yes, you can, Walter said firmly. Because this box, what's inside it, it's not meant to sit in a dead man's pocket. It's meant to be with someone who understands what it represents. Someone who knows the difference between what costs money and what's actually valuable. Steve looked around the studio, at the cameras still rolling, at the audience watching with rapt attention, at Walter's family standing behind their patriarch with expressions of love and support. He realized that this wasn't about the game anymore. This wasn't about points on a board or money to be won. This was about human connection in its purest form. Steve reached out and accepted the box. It was heavier than he'd expected, not because of its physical weight, but because of what it carried. Stories, memories, love that had survived loss. What's inside? Steve asked softly. Walter's eyes grew bright with unshed tears. Open it. Steve lifted the hand-carved lid with infinite care. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, was a simple gold wedding band. Not expensive, not fancy, just a plain gold ring that had been worn smooth by 40 years of marriage. That was Martha's wedding ring, Walter said. She made me promise to give it to someone who would understand what it meant. Not the gold, not the money it might be worth, but what it represents. 40 years of choosing love every single day. 40 years of building something together that no outside force could destroy. Steve stared at the ring, and for the first time in his television career, words completely failed him. This wasn't just a gift. This was a sacred trust, a piece of someone's heart, offered freely to a stranger who had somehow earned it, simply by being kind. Mr. Thompson, Steve finally managed. This is too precious. This belongs with your family. Walter shook his head gently. My family has the love, Mr. Harvey. They have the memories. They have each other. But this ring, it needs to be with someone who can carry its message forward. Someone who can remind the world that real wealth isn't about what you own. It's about how you love. He paused, looking directly into Steve's eyes. You do that every day, Mr. Harvey. Every person who walks onto this stage, you treat them like family. You listen to their stories like they matter. You make people feel seen and heard and valued. That's what Martha did. That's what this ring represents. Steve closed the box carefully, holding it against his chest. When he looked up, his eyes were wet with tears. He wasn't trying to hide. Walter, he said, and everyone noticed that he dropped the formal Mr. Thompson. This is the most generous gift anyone has ever given me. But I need you to understand something. This ring isn't leaving your family. It's joining my family, and my family is going to make sure your family gets the fresh start you deserve. Walter's composure finally cracked. Tears began to flow down his weathered cheeks, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of a man who had been carrying a burden alone and suddenly found himself surrounded by support. Steve turned to address the entire studio, the wooden box still pressed against his heart. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying an authority that transcended entertainment. We just witnessed something extraordinary. Mr. Walter Thompson just taught us the difference between being broke and being poor. He may have lost his farm, but he's one of the richest men I've ever met. He looked back at Walter, then at the Thompson family still standing at their podium. And here's what we're going to do. Walter, your family just won this game. I don't care what the scoreboard says. You won the moment you showed us what real generosity looks like. The audience began to applaud, but Steve held up his hand. He wasn't finished. But more than that, Walter, I want you to know that Martha's ring is going to help me remember something important every single day. It's going to remind me that the most valuable things in life can't be bought or sold or taken away by banks or droughts or any other kind of hardship. Steve reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his personal business card, not a prop, but his actual contact information. Walter, I want you to keep this, and I want you to call me next week. Because I know some people who are in the business of helping good men get back on their feet. Martha's ring is going to be the seed that helps your family plant new roots. Walter took the card with shaking hands. Mr. Harvey, I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything, Steve replied. You already said everything when you offered me the most precious thing you owned. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are. Steve turned to the audience, to the cameras, to everyone watching. You know what we learned today? We learned that some gifts are too precious to keep, that the most generous people are often the ones who have the least to give, and that real wealth has nothing to do with bank accounts and everything to do with the size of your heart. The episode that aired 3 months later became one of the most watched in Family Feud history, not because of the competition, but because viewers witnessed something increasingly rare: pure, unguarded human generosity. But the story didn't end there. True to his word, Steve connected Walter with agricultural investors who specialized in helping displaced farmers. Within 6 months, Walter Thompson was working a smaller but sustainable farm in eastern Kansas, using modern drought-resistant techniques that ensured he'd never face the same devastating losses again. Martha's wedding ring sits in a place of honor in Steve's home office, displayed in Walter's hand-carved box. Every morning, when Steve prepares for his day, he looks at that ring and remembers Walter's lesson about the difference between wealth and richness. The Thompson family still watches Family Feud together every evening, a tradition that now spans 3 generations. Walter, at 66, has become something of a local legend in his new community, known not just as a successful farmer, but as a man who understands the true value of things. And Steve Harvey? He learned something that day that changed how he approaches every show, every interaction, every moment he spends in the public eye. He learned that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the humblest packages, offered by people who have every reason to keep what little they have, but choose instead to share it with the world. Walter Thompson's gift became more than just a cherished keepsake. It became a daily reminder that true generosity has nothing to do with how much you have, and everything to do with how willing you are to share it, and that the most valuable things in life are always the ones that multiply when given away. Because sometimes, a farmer's simple gift can teach a television host about the real meaning of wealth. Sometimes a hand-carved box can carry more value than any bank account. And sometimes the most precious things are offered not by those who have the most, but by those who understand what actually matters when everything else is stripped away.